The sea air was sharp with salt and smoke. On a narrow strip of Japanese shoreline, 200 mounted warriors sat silent atop restless horses. Their lamellar armor rattled like the hiss of a snake. Ahead of them, a black tide of Mongol soldiers, tens of thousands, swarmed off their ships and onto the beach. Drums thundered. Arrows blotted out the evening sun. It should have been a slaughter, but the samurai did not retreat. At their head rode a weather-scarred veteran, banners fluttering from his back like wings. He raised his spear, murmured a prayer to the war gods, and spurred forward. 200 riders charged into 50,000 men. What happened next would carve itself into legend. A stand so improbable that even Mongol chroniclers wrote of it with a hint of awe. This is the story of how a handful of samurai warriors faced the might of the greatest empire on earth and lived to tell it. By the mid-13th century, the Mongol Empire was the most fearsome power the world had ever seen. From the steppes of Mongolia, Genghis Khan's heirs had conquered China, Persia, the Middle East, and Russia. The Khans believed the sky itself had granted them a divine mandate to rule all under heaven. Few dared resist. Across the sea, the islands of Japan seemed a minor curiosity. But to Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis and ruler of the vast Yuan dynasty, Japan represented both opportunity and insult. Japanese pirates had raided Korean and Chinese coasts, and Japan's shogunate had refused Kublai's demands for tribute. In the Mongol worldview, such defiance could not stand. In 1274, Kublai launched his first invasion of Japan. He sent a fleet of hundreds of ships carrying perhaps 20,000 to 30,000 Mongol, Chinese, and Korean troops. They landed at Hakata Bay on Kyushu. The Japanese fought fiercely but were driven back. Then a sudden storm wrecked much of the Mongol fleet. Japan called it divine favor. Kublai called it unfinished business. 7 years later, in 1281, he tried again. This time, the invasion was far larger, perhaps 140,000 men on two massive armadas. While the main force assembled, a smaller Mongol detachment, perhaps 50,000 men, struck at northern Kyushu to secure a foothold. Waiting for them on the beaches were the local samurai of the Higo and Chikuzan provinces, hastily summoned by the Kamakura shogunate. They numbered only a few hundred. The Kamakura shogunate ruled in the name of a distant emperor, but power lay with the shogun's regents, the Hojo clan. Japan had no standing army. When threatened, the shogunate called upon provincial warriors to muster and fight. These were not massed foot soldiers but mounted samurai, elite, individualistic fighters trained for single combat and steeped in a code of personal honor. Their enemy could not have been more different. The Mongol army was a professional war machine. Its core was steppe cavalry who had mastered coordinated maneuvers, composite bows, and massed volleys. In this campaign, they were joined by Chinese infantry and Korean sailors. Siege engines, catapults, and explosive bombs came with them, weapons the Japanese had never seen. Hakata Bay's beaches became a chessboard of clashing military cultures. The Japanese had prepared. After the first invasion, they had built a massive stone wall along parts of the coastline, stretching for miles, an early medieval seawall designed to keep invaders from landing. They also stationed watchtowers and signal fires. But when the Mongols arrived at dawn, their numbers dwarfed anything the samurai had expected. One chronicler writes of the sea turning black with sails. Another tells of drums so loud they seemed to shake the earth. The local commanders sent frantic messengers inland begging for reinforcements. They knew that if the Mongols broke through here, the road to the Japanese heartland would lie open. At the center of this crisis stood a small band of horsemen, perhaps 200 samurai and their retainers, led by men whose names flicker through history: Takazaki Suenaga, Kikuchi Takafusa, and other warriors of Kyushu's clans. They understood the odds. They fought anyway. For Kublai Khan, capturing Kyushu was the key to conquering Japan. It would give him a base to stage further landings and crush the shogunate piecemeal. For the Japanese, stopping the Mongols at the waterline was existential. If the invaders secured a foothold, they could bring in their full force and march inland. No one knew if reinforcements would arrive in time. The wall might slow the enemy, but it could not fight them. In other words, the entire fate of Japan's independence in 1281 rested, for a critical window, on a handful of men with swords and bows facing an empire's worth of troops. The samurai of this era fought as mounted archers first and swordsmen second. They carried powerful longbows called yumi, which could be shot from horseback, and curved swords, tachi, for close combat. Armor was lamellar, overlapping scales of iron and leather tied with silk cords, light enough for mobility but strong enough to deflect arrows. The Mongols brought composite bows with superior range and power, disciplined formations, and new terror weapons. Iron bombs filled with gunpowder and shrapnel. When these exploded, Japanese horses panicked, an early form of shock and awe. This clash of styles, individual duels versus mass tactics, would define the coming fight. Unable to land en masse because of the stone wall, the Mongols anchored their ships offshore. Japanese small boats darted out at night, boarding enemy vessels in sudden raids. These guerrilla attacks disrupted Mongol planning and eroded their morale. Imagine being a soldier on a rocking ship at midnight, hearing war cries in the darkness as samurai leap aboard with flashing swords. Takazaki Suenaga himself later commissioned illustrated scrolls showing these raids, the earliest battle comics in Japan, depicting himself leaping from boat to boat under fire. Whether embellished or not, they show the spirit of the defense. Aggressive, audacious, and unafraid of impossible odds. By harassing the enemy fleet and holding the beaches, the samurai bought precious time for reinforcements to assemble inland. Every day they held out increased the chance that storms, the dreaded typhoons of summer, might strike again. We leave our warriors here for a moment, crouched behind the stone wall as the sun rises over Hakata Bay. Out at sea, an armada bristling with soldiers waits for the order to attack. On the beaches, 200 samurai tighten their helmet cords and whisper prayers. The greatest invasion force Japan has ever seen is about to crash upon them. Days stretched into a tense standoff. Mongol ships floated just out of bowshot like a floating city of war. On the shore, the samurai kept watch, sharpening arrows and mending armor. Inland, more warriors from neighboring provinces were mustering, but they were still days away. For now, the beach belonged to 200 men who refused to give ground. Their commanders understood they could not win a pitched field battle. Instead, they would bleed the invaders with night raids, force them to stay on their ships, and pray for storms. It was a strategy born of desperation, but desperation can make men inventive. Each evening, the samurai studied the tides and currents, planning their assaults. Small boats crept out at night like shadows. Grappling hooks snagged enemy rails. In close quarters chaos, swords flashed and men toppled overboard. Fire arrows hissed into sailcloth. The Mongols were used to overwhelming numbers. They were not used to an enemy who turned the sea itself into an ambush. Eventually, the Mongol commanders lost patience. Under the cover of catapult fire, they sent landing parties toward gaps in the stone wall. Shields overlapped, drums boomed, arrows arced. The beach exploded into motion. Takazaki Suenaga and his comrades charged. Horses splashed through surf, arrows whistled past. The samurai's tactic was to hit hard and fast before the enemy could deploy, then wheel away and strike again. This was not single combat with honor cries. This was hit-and-run warfare against a massed army. The Mongols answered with their own innovations. They advanced in tight ranks, shields interlocked, archers behind them loosing disciplined volleys. Exploding bombs burst among the defenders, throwing up sand and blood. For a moment, it seemed the wall would be overrun. Then the samurai counterattacked. Small groups of riders galloped out from hidden coves, striking the flanks, snatching prisoners, retreating before the Mongols could encircle them. Each raid cost lives, but it slowed the invasion to a crawl. As the days dragged on, the Mongols could not build a secure beachhead. Their ships lay packed together in the hot summer waters, a floating camp ripe for disease and unrest. Japanese night raids burned supply junks and captured weapons. The invaders were forced to sleep in armor, jumpy at every splash. On shore, reinforcements finally began to trickle in: more samurai, more retainers. The defenders grew from a few hundred to a few thousand, enough to man the wall in shifts. But the legend of the first days belonged to that original core who had stood virtually alone. In late summer, the heavens answered. Dark clouds rose over the East China Sea. Winds stiffened. Rain began to lash the decks of the Mongol fleet. Typhoon season had arrived. What happened next became myth. For 2 days and nights, a furious storm smashed the anchored ships. Waves tore hulls apart. Masts splintered. Men were swept into the sea. Some vessels crashed against each other like battering rams. The defenders watched from the shore as the greatest armada in the world disintegrated before their eyes. Samurai boats darted out between squalls, cutting down survivors and burning crippled ships. By the time the sky cleared, tens of thousands of Mongol soldiers were dead or stranded. Those who tried to crawl ashore were cut down or captured. The invasion of 1281 had ended in catastrophe. The Japanese called the storm kamikaze, divine wind. It was seen as proof that the gods protected their islands. But behind the miracle was hard reality. Without the samurai's wall, raids, and stubborn resistance, the typhoon might have struck a well-entrenched enemy instead of a vulnerable fleet. The defeat changed history. Kublai Khan never again launched a major invasion of Japan. His empire turned inward, bleeding resources on other fronts. Japan remained unconquered, its warrior class emboldened and its shogunate's legitimacy reinforced. For the samurai who fought at Hakata Bay, the battle became a touchstone of identity. Illustrated scrolls commissioned by Takazaki Suenaga show him presenting captured heads to officials, recounting his exploits. Whether embellished or not, they became part of the cultural memory of defiance, a small band holding back an empire. The Mongols, for their part, recorded the disaster with bitterness. Their chronicles mention Japanese raids, strange walls, and the deadly storm. Even they conceded the ferocity of the island warriors who fought like demons from the sea. Modern historians note that the so-called divine wind alone did not save Japan. It was the combination of fortifications, aggressive tactics, and the resilience of a few hundred warriors that forced the Mongols to remain exposed on their ships when the typhoon struck. Strategy and weather, human courage and chance together, they shaped the outcome. In that sense, the stand of the 200 samurai is not just a story of heroic last resistance. It's an early lesson in asymmetric warfare. How a small force, using terrain, mobility, and audacity, can frustrate a vastly larger opponent. Today, if you stand on the beaches of Hakata Bay, you can still see remnants of the stone wall built to stop the Mongols. The surf whispers over the rocks. It's hard to imagine that this quiet shoreline was once the stage for one of the most lopsided confrontations in military history. 200 men on horseback, 50,000 invaders at sea, a storm waiting beyond the horizon. Their stand became a legend, their legend became a nation's myth, and their myth still echoes in stories of defiance against overwhelming odds. If you found this story of courage and cunning compelling, join us next time as we uncover another hidden chapter of history when a forgotten fortress and a handful of defenders shaped the fate of an empire. Subscribe, share, and stay tuned for more tales where the past roars back to life.